the front line is moving faster nowadays. So Ukraine has less troops and they're willing to retreat more than before. So you remember how in 2022, 2023, the Ukrainians would fight for every meter of ground, but they lost a lot of troops doing that, especially when you face Russian firepower. Everything also changed with Russian FAB bombs, which can obliterate strongholds in a couple minutes. So the Ukrainians thought of a way of just retreating, holding a position, having the FPV drones eliminate as many enemy forces as possible, and then retreat, as to not lose too many troops. That's why when we see the videos of Russian trench assaults, oftentimes these trenches are completely empty of troops. Now, in my opinion, okay, I think that the Ukrainians deep down have already accepted the loss of the Donbas, and that they're willing to fight even if the Donbas has been lost. Now the question is, are the Russians going to continue the war after Donbas has been fully conquered? I think this is the big question we have to think about, because Donetsk is about to get crushed. Luhansk, I think they're a couple kilometers away from full capture. The Russians have 99.5% of Luhansk Oblast. Donetsk, every day now, the Russians are literally putting the entire focus of their armed forces on Donetsk Oblast. Who knows what the situation will be at the end of the year? The big battles are going to be Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which are the heart of the Donbas. We can expect big battles there. But what happens once Donetsk is completely taken over by the Russians? I don't think the Ukrainians can effectively hold these oblasts at the moment. The Ukrainian plan is a bit like what the Germans were doing on the Eastern Front starting 1943 and 1944. Retreat and try to inflict as many casualties on the Russians and hope that the Russian army collapses by then. That's
man, you know, it's ironic you say it quite that way. We had a very pro-Ukrainian person on yesterday, or day before yesterday, and I asked that pointed question: upon what basis does Ukraine continue fighting when all the evidence says that they cannot even forget about winning? That's not even on the table, but can even prevent Russia from advancing. And he just says that we're hoping in a miracle and that they're going to continue to fight. And that seems to be pretty prevalent, I think. On the
they hope for what happened to Russia during World War I, that the army just stops, that there's a collapse at the rear, some sort of revolution, and that the Russian army is forced to stop, morale collapses, and everybody goes home. This is what they hope.
Yeah, but that didn't happen until about 5 million Russians were killed in the war. So I think we got a long way to go before they get to that point. Plus, the
situation has changed, definitely, and the situation has changed. But I think that somehow the Ukrainians accepted the loss of the eastern regions of their country. But stopping the war is going to be difficult. I read somewhere in some forums about Ukrainian population, and they said something very interesting. The soldiers were complaining about the lack of, how can I say, interest of the general Ukrainian population in the war, in that they don't care that much in what is happening in the east of the country. And they said that it's only when the Russians are going to be in front of Kyiv that the Ukrainians are once again going to volunteer in mass to help Ukraine. Only if the Russians get close to the capital city will everybody just, there's going to be a second wave of patriotism to help the country. But as long as the battle is so far away, it seems that a lot of people don't care. And
yeah, I don't dispute that. That's a reasonable thing, given what we've seen. It's unfortunate that it would that would happen again, that they would get up to that point, but that's beyond the scope of today's show. But I want to zero in, because you keep talking about the Donetsk area especially, and last week we had I think I mentioned a minute ago, George Mamsarov on the show, who was a former Russian soldier and current war correspondent for Soloviev Live, I think is the name of the show in Russia. And I asked him a specific question about Pakrosk and how important that is to the entire Eastern Front. Here's what he said. Which is the most important, as far as you can, as a journalist, can tell? Is it to try and cut off Zaporizhia, or is it to try and cut off Pakrovsk?
Pakrovsk is the most important part, because you have to destroy enemy forces there, and it will lead to the front collapse. and it will lead to Zaporozhye, that Russian forces will free Zaporozhye from the Ukrainian forces.
Well, and that's actually one of the next questions is if Pakrosk falls, and you can see as I'm showing on the map here that Russia has been making considerable progress on the northern flank or on this eastern flank, depending on your perspective. If Pakrosk gets cut off, even if it's surrounded, even before it maybe get taken, then that leaves a large area of Ukraine open. Does Russia have the forces to conduct a penetration with operational reserves if they make a breakthrough in the Pokrovsk area?
First of all, I want to say that it's a really good question because it's everything about control. When your forces advance and they advance quickly, you have to make logistics, and you have to think about how your forces will receive supplies, etc., etc. And Russia now has operational reserves which could be moved into enemy's breaches. And the thing is that Pakrovsk is not the only place of Russian pressure, and there are several such places where Ukrainian front lines could collapse any moment, and we have reserves ready to advance and to secure more area.
Now, that's what the Russians said about Pakrosk, but about a week before that, you also talked about Pakrovsk.
As we speak, Russian storm detachments are currently carrying a wide flanking maneuver westwards. I'll make another video with more details about this operation. But what you have to understand right now is how the Russians are not getting bogged down in street-by-street battles. Instead, they're simply bypassing these urban areas. And by doing so, they also bypass most of Ukraine's strongholds. The operational objective of this orc doctrine seems to be Rodinske. That was a situation in that sector on June 1st, plus 9 kilometers in a month. It's absolutely insane. The first step will be to take control of the Kazeni-Tariets River, as well as the villages of Raziny, Novotarietske, Mayak, and maybe even Novoekonomichne. Then comes this set of industrial areas and mines that can act as tactical bulwarks for Ukraine. At last, if the Russians thrust even deeper all the way to the Golden Point, they'll reach the 205-15 road and the settlement of Radinske. I don't expect the battle to be easy, especially since the stakes are so high. But at the same time, if the Russians continue at this rate, they'll be in Radinske within a month.
That's what you said on July the 4th. And if you look on the map that we have right here in front of us here, they've made some pretty good movement here in just the last few days. And so it may not even be a month before they get to Rodinsky. What is your view of what the Pakrovsk area means and where this could go next?
Well, the situation is, well, you see, first of all, how the front can move very fast all of a sudden. So I'm talking about a month, could be within a week. So things advance very fast. Now, the Russians will try to encircle Pokrovsk, but I don't think that it's going to be that easy. Hold on. Let me check the situation. Yeah, so everything for Pokrovsk will depend on how fast the Russians can pass these bulwarks that I talked about in the video. There's numerous industrial mines, so bottlenecks. Let's see how that goes. If the Russians pass through like a hot knife through butter, Pokrovsk could fall very, very soon, in a couple weeks at most. But knowing my experience with the Russians in such areas, it's going to be difficult to pass through. The Ukrainians can really concentrate a lot of firepower in these areas. So, but the Ukrainians have 20 to 30,000 troops in this pocket of Pokrovsk, Mirnohrad. The Russians are not going to go street by street. So they're going to try to encircle and force the Ukrainians out, like they've done with every city, like they've done in Avdiivka. Now, the question is, what is going to happen once the city falls? Because it's just a matter of time before it falls. It's not even a question of if the Ukrainians can hold it at this point. Well, do you have a map available?
I do, yeah. Let me put that back up there. There we go.
Okay. So you see, the Russians are coming crashing from the east towards Pokrovsk, and they're gonna swallow and the entire region is gonna be engulfed in just Russian troops. If the Ukrainians manage to stop this eastern flanking operation, then maybe the Russians will have to go for a frontal assault, and it's going to be like Avdiivka, but on a bigger scale. But now, if you move a little bit to the right, the map, yeah, there's another salient, and I wanted to pay attention to Kostiantynivka. So I think the Russians now, with this breakthrough, what's important to know is that they're about to capture two very important Ukrainian cities. So what I think is going to happen is that they're going to fall on Pokrovsk first, my apologies, and then they're going to pivot on the east and take care of Kostiantynivka, because this is a very important objective. I have a huge respect for the Russian guests that you had before. I follow their Telegram, but to think that the fall of Pokrovsk will lead to a complete collapse of the front, I don't think so. Especially with drones, we forget that to achieve such a breakthrough, you have to concentrate a lot of forces. But we've seen that concentrating more troops in a certain sector will just increase the casualties for you. So it's better to launch small, continuous attacks and exhaust the enemy than to have this final breakthrough desert storm type of operation. It's not going to happen.
Let me ask you this question, because we've been focusing on drones quite a bit, and we've actually interviewed people on both sides of the line, and they nearly say the exact same thing, that there's, unlike almost every other category of war where it's in the Russia's favor, the drones are a basic parity. And they both talk about how difficult it is to even move around here. But we also saw on July 1st, Julian Rupke from Germany say that the density of the Ukraine troops is getting thinner and thinner. So isn't there a risk at some point that they could get thin enough that in some area, whether it's Kostiantynivka or somewhere around Pakrosk or Zaporizhzhia down in the south, that anywhere that Russia could maybe make a breakthrough where there's not enough drone pilots even left to fly, and then they could, make a dash to the interior of the country? Is that possible?
It is, but think about it. You can still put minefields. There's a lot of ways to slow down attacking forces. It's possible, but I wouldn't be such a doomer for the Ukrainian armed forces. They took losses, that's for sure, and for them to replenish the losses is harder and harder. But to think that the Russians are about to have such a breakthrough I'm not so sure. I think the Russians want to go into these urban areas, to take these cities, because they have huge strategic value. Because, okay, let's say the Russians take Pokrovsk and then they push 20 kilometers to the north and west. That's potato fields. Absolutely no value. Yes, you enter some oblast. Politically speaking, it's nice to see on the map. In reality, it doesn't have so much value as to take these cities. Cities are extremely important for logistics and to concentrate your forces. If the Russians take Kostiantynivka, then they can move on from one city to another and just mop up Donetsk Oblast. Whereas the potato fields at the rear country, not that useful. So the best way to explain the Russian tactics right now is like the battles between the Union and the Confederates in 1864. So it was really one bloodbath after another, but the Russians are winning the battle of attrition. Even at a 1-to-1 rate, the Russians can replace their casualties. The Ukrainians cannot. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me, I want to run back to the map again here. Something you said a second ago. You said you thought maybe the next places would, after Kostiantynivka, would be Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. What is the importance of these areas in the overall conduct of the war?
You see, the thing is that Slavyansk is where the Donbas war started. This is where you had Russian mercenaries in a way, and some local troops take up the Slavyansk to start the rebellion in Donbas. It has huge symbolic value, and also it holds also political value, because it's one of the biggest cities with Kramatorsk in Donbas. If you see, look, if Kostiantynivka falls, the Russians can follow this northern road step by step, and at the same time, you can have another pincer from the north via Liman. And this is where the Russians are also preparing a push. So they're going to come from both the north and the south just like they always do. They're never going to attack from one axis alone. So these cities are very, and you see there's a road, Slavyansk, there's a road in the west. Yes, this one. This is where the Russians would have to reach to really encircle it, but it's very far from the front at the moment. So to push into the potato fields is actually going to increase Russian losses. They're going to send their troops, especially now with winter that is coming and less greenery to camouflage your forces. A lot of troops and vehicles are going to be sitting ducks. So the advantage of fighting in urban areas for the Russians is that it's very hard for drones to actually counter these units, because drones are very good in open terrain. They're not good in urban areas because you have so many hiding spots.
It's a good point.
You have basements everywhere, so the troops can hide from artillery. They can hide from drones. These grenade dropping drones, the bomber drones, they're not very useful in urban areas because you have houses, you're covered up. Whereas in open terrain, these bomber drones are very lethal, especially now that they drop 4 explosive charges at a time compared to only 1 grenade at 1 year ago. So pushing in open terrain is a dream of World War II at the moment, unless the Russians have new weapons that can just turn off all Ukrainian drones and just jam all the capabilities. I don't see it happening.